exercise science student at Charles Sturt University. The following presentation is going to be on motor neuron disease. So what are the learning objectives? Firstly, you're going to have an introduction where we're going to introduce a bit of background and context for this disorder, the pathophysiology, so the cause and effect of the disorder, typical signs and symptoms that people should be aware of or would typically present in someone with motor neuron disease, effects on movement control, what the treatments and interventions at this time are, role of exercise, the guidelines and possible benefits of it. So firstly, what is motor neuron disease? Motor neuron disease is pretty much any disease that is degenerative neurological disease that affects motor neurons. The most common of these is ALS, or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. ALS affects about 0.002% of the population, or about 2 in every 100,000, although it's more common in males than it is females, with about 0.005%. There's no known cure at this time, although there is a lot of research going into ALS and what causes it. Ultimately, it's a fatal condition. 90% of cases are sporadic, meaning that it happens pretty randomly out of the blue with no real reason, no genetic factors. So 10% are familiar. This is known as Fall's disease or familiar amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and this is hereditary. So the pathophysiology of the disorder. It affects upper and lower motor neurons, usually in a combination of both. These lead to the motor neurons dying. So these motor neurons are the things that innervate muscles, so obviously you're going to get progressive loss of muscle contraction until muscles eventually cease. The life expectancy for someone with ALS is usually about 3 to 5 years post-diagnosis, but it can be as low as 1 year. So on the left-hand side here, we have a bit of a diagram of the nervous system. So obviously most people will be pretty familiar with the brain. Coming out of the brain obviously is the spinal cord, and as we go down, but what we're really going to be focusing on today are these motor neurons. So you can kind of see the yellow and blue lines coming out. So these are the neurons that innervate the tissue around the body. So as we said before, ALS affects upper and lower motor neurons. So we can see just a bit of a definition. So an upper motor neuron is something that comes from the brain, goes through the midbrain, the pons, the medulla, and synapses in the spinal cord, and that's the end of the upper motor neuron. The lower motor neuron starts in the spinal cord, so a synapse there, and come out and attach to muscles or tissues, in this case muscles in the diagram. You can see it attaches to muscle fibers. So one nerve might attach to a series of muscle fibers, or it might attach to a single muscle fiber, and this is known as a motor unit. So this picture would be typical of someone with ALS, the one on the left. So a normal neuron, as we can see, is got a normal soma, normal dendrites, and quite a normal axon on it. So it's thick, it's got the myelinated sheath around it, attached to a muscle that's quite full. On the right here we have here we have a diseased neuron. So you can see the soma and the dendrites are still quite normal, but what's really affected is that axon. You can see it's quite disintegrated, the myelin's disintegrated, and as a result that muscle's atrophied due to lack of stimulation from that motor neuron. So what causes this debilitating disease? Well, doctors don't really know what actually causes it to an exact, but they have a fair idea on what could cause it. So there's a defect in astrocytes. So astrocytes are glial cells. So I've got a picture here of an astrocyte, and the interesting fact, the reason they're called astrocytes is because they look like stars. So one of the main jobs of these astrocytes is to clear waste products and regulate the amount of waste in the nervous system. So When these are faulty, we get a buildup of glutamate, and glutamate's not really a bad thing because it's necessary for muscle contraction, but if we have a build-up of it, we get a level of toxicity, which causes an overexcitement and the neuron to die. One of the main mechanisms that's thought to be the reason of this is a decreased amount of EAATs, which is excitatory amino acid transporters. So these are usually common in the synaptic spaces between where the astrocytes would attach. So a decrease of these would mean a lesser amount to be able to shuttle glutamate out of the extracellular fluid, and that's how we get a build-up of that in there. So how does that happen though? That's what really has doctors a bit baffled. There's a few theories, and they're usually to do with genetics. So there's human superoxide dismutate gene, or HSOD1. That's a regulatory oxidative gene. There's also mutations, less research in this field, but there's some research to show that the FUS gene and the ANG gene, which are more to do with transcription, could also be affected. But the main one is that HSOD1. Obviously, and again, 10% is related to family. So what is the HSOD1 gene? So it's thought to be a key regulator of oxidation in the nervous system. And mutations to this is obviously going to cause excessive oxidative stress, which leads to neuron death. So typical signs and symptoms are muscle weakness, loss of muscle function. It generally starts in one limb and kind of spreads. Another interesting sign or symptom is random laughter or crying that is not attached to an emotional state. So when people just start laughing or crying with no real meaning behind it. The muscle weakness and loss of muscle function is obviously when you have a lower amount of neurons, motor neurons attaching to muscles, like one by one, the muscle cells are going to atrophy, and when larger muscle groups atrophy, that's when you lose function of the muscle. So here we have an example of a young Stephen Hawking, Professor Stephen Hawking, when he was around the time when he was first diagnosed with ALS. And that's a more recent photo down the bottom of him, and we can see how debilitating that is. The reason why he doesn't fit into that 3 to 5 year framework of lifespan is because they suspect that he got juvenile ALS, which is a more slow and progressive version of the disease, opposed to the adult onset one, which usually will end in death after about 3 to 5 years. So again, we can see the effects on motor control are fairly obvious. So there's a progressive loss of motor ability. Pretty much begins with muscle weakness, and we discussed on the previous slide to this. Starts as a partial loss of movement and progresses to a full loss of movement. Once there's a complete loss of movement, including loss of movement in the diaphragm, this ends in death as the lungs can't ventilate anymore. So what can we do to try and help people with this condition? So there's been a lot of research done in mice on gene therapy. So one study that was done this year actually studied two groups of mice. One had the SOD1 gene, or a mutation of that gene. It was the G933A mutation, and that was the control group. The other group was given the same mutation, so the SOD1 mutation, but it was also given ATF3, which stands for active transcription factor 3, which is just another gene. So we can see in the group that was just given the SOD1, that's very similar to the condition someone would expect with ALS. So there's a massive loss of neurons. We can see in that first graph, after 60 days to 90 days, there's almost a halving of the amount of motor neurons, and after 120 days it's down to 20%. So that's a very speedy drop in motor neurons, as well as the axons, the neuromuscular junctions, and the muscle weight, which would be to do with atrophy. So they will have a linear regression as well. You see in the group that have the ATF3, there's pretty much no change after 30 days, even with that mutated gene of large axons, neuromuscular junction activity, and muscular weight. And there's about a 50% slowing of the actual death of motor neurons as well. Figure B and C better illustrate it really, because you can actually get a visual of the neurons attached to the muscle fibers. But you can see there's about a 50% slowing of the death of them. So what does that really mean for people though? Obviously they're in mice, so it doesn't have an exactness with human biology, but it is encouraging findings to see that they are starting to look at gene therapy to be able to at least slow the rate of the disorder. Another, and it's kind of in the same vein, there's a compound called aremoclomol, which is shown in mice to give 22% longer lifespan to mice that have been injected with the SOD mutation, just like in the last study. So another interesting thing, and this is in humans this time, the two motor neurons that aren't really affected by ALS are the optic nerve and the nerves that innervate the sphincters around the pelvic area. They're not too sure why they are not affected, but it's another avenue of research to find out what causes this. It could be something to do with the structures inside those neurons, or they might have properties that protect them from that cell death. But another interesting avenue. And then there's a lot of studies to show that certain genes and mutations to those genes can have a protective effect on neurons. So even though they don't know really what causes it and there's no real cure, there is a lot of research going on right now, particularly with genetics, to try to get a grip on what causes it and how to fix it. So exercise is the next one. So there's a reluctance amongst practitioners to actually give exercise due to it tends to cause a progression of the actual condition. The reason for this is they don't really recover from sessions too well. So if you look on this graph down here, this would be a model of someone's training regime, like a healthy person's training regime, and pretty much just the model of stimulation and adaptation. So if you follow the green line, you can see someone has a training stimulus, it valleys down, they're detrained, and then the body goes through a phase of supercompensation where they get much stronger, the neurons become more efficient, and the muscle grows. With people with ALS, this doesn't really happen. So if you follow the pink line on this one, the pink line on this model is still a healthy person, but with someone with ALS, so if they trained vigorously, particularly with weights, but it could be aerobic as well, on that pink line, they would hit that valley, so they would be really detrained, but then they wouldn't have the capabilities to regenerate. So that valley would probably be their new benchmark. So you could see how that would escalate into quickly progressing the disease further and further along. Another reason why exercise is not really beneficial for people with this condition is the amount of cell oxidization that happens. And like we were saying before, if it doesn't have that SOD1 gene firing properly and regulating the amount of oxidation in the cell, that oxidation is going to lead to further cell death. So exercise in light amounts has been shown to have some positive effects, but all in all, it might not be the best thing to do with these patients. So in conclusion, we can see that ALS is quite a devastating and debilitating condition. Obviously, it is a loss of movement, which eventually causes death. There is hope though. So a lot of research has been done on gene therapy and mutations into gene therapy to try to combat this this motor neuron death. But there has to be a lot more research done. Thanks for listening to my presentation. These are my references.